So I am the analytics manager at the Taxi and Limousine Commission, and today I'm going to talk to you guys about taxis. No surprise there. How many of you guys have been to New York City? I'm sure a lot, but I just want to make sure. Oh, okay. So we're familiar with taxis in New York City. We know kind of what's going on. You guys are probably going to learn some of the new rules, some rules we have here, some of the new things, some of the different taxi services that there are. So this will be pretty interesting. But what I really want you guys to walk away with at the end of this presentation, I want you to understand what we do. I want you to get an overview of the industry and see some of the interesting stuff that we're working with, some of the new data that we have. And I also want you to see how we interface with the public. You know, what data do we put out in the open? How accessible is it for people to use? Things like that. So let's just get into the weeds because I have a lot. Let's go through the housekeeping first. So we'll start with who is TLC, or rather what is TLC, and TLC is a New York City agency that regulates the for-hire vehicle market. When I use the for-hire vehicle word right here in its broad sense, we're talking about taxis. So a lot of you are probably thinking yellow taxis, you're thinking Uber, you're thinking Lyft, and you guys are right. I mean, those are the kinds of vehicles we regulate. Here are three industry sectors. We've sort of grouped everything so that you can see the different parts of this industry that we regulate. We have our yellow medallion taxis. These are everywhere. In other municipalities, they're also yellow. Sometimes they're a little bit orange. But we have our yellow medallion taxis, and there are about 13,587 of these vehicles. They are permitted to do street hail pickups. That's what the medallion is for. It is a city permit. For those of you wondering what a street hail pickup is, it's when you raise your hand. Yes, people still do that to call a taxi, especially in New York. In addition to that, we have these lime green, yes, lime green, borough taxis, and I've noticed that you guys have that here as well. When I got off the airport, I saw some green taxis, and I started wondering who came up with the color first, or if we both just copied from someone else. But these borough taxis are also allowed to pick up people, except in certain areas. In this case, they were created primarily to serve the outer boroughs. So when I speak about the outer boroughs, I'm talking about Brooklyn, Queens, Staten Island, the Bronx. These were areas that were traditionally underserved, and so these green cabs were sort of created to fill in that gap. Now they operate with something called an SHL permit. It's not a medallion, but it is a city permit. It gives them the right to do the pickups as they do. The last, more mysterious sector that I really want to highlight is the for-hire vehicle sector. Now in this case, that is where Uber, Lyft, companies like Via, which I know you guys don't have yet. I've spoken to a couple Uber drivers while I was here, and that's where they're nested. They have found their comfort zone in there. And so these vehicles can't just pick you up on the street. These vehicles you have to call on a phone, you have to use an app. You don't have to, you don't get to just hail on the street and say, hey, pick me up. That would be an illegal pickup. And as you can see, when you look at the number of vehicles, just sort of giving you a precursor, 102,000 vehicles. And I'll say that's continuing to grow, so keep that in mind. Now, pay no mind to the title, this is an error on my part. But here, what I was trying to highlight is the kind of data that we collect. I wanted to give you guys sort of an idea of what we're bringing in terms of data. Right here, we have a visual of trip record level data. For any of you who've worked with data, you might have ran across the TLC taxi trip record data set. Each row is a trip, so we collect this information from yellow taxis, from green taxis, and some of that information from the for-hire vehicle industry as well, aka Uber, Lyft, etc. In addition to that data, we collect licensing data, we collect vehicle information, and much, much more. So there's so much data, and with so much data, there's so much more responsibility. So, how do we use this data? Well, we use it responsibly, I hope. We use it for public safety, we use it for consumer protection, for driver protection. I'll give you an example of a consumer protection issue. We recently passed driver fatigue rules. Now, for any of you who are not familiar with the term driver fatigue, it means when you're driving for too long or you haven't had enough sleep and you're tired, and that's a safety concern, right? There are research studies that show that these are safety concerns. So we looked at the trip record data. We looked to see how long drivers were driving, and we realized, oh, this is a problem that needs to be solved. And so a policy was implemented to try and rein in any drivers who are driving for too long, right? And here we have like a dashboard that one of our licensing units creates, just sort of tracking our new application, things like that. So we have a lot of data coming in. Now, we got through the housekeeping stuff. Hopefully you kind of have an idea of what's going on in your city, what are the different cabs that we regulate. Let's get an overview of the industry, right? Let's see what's going on. So we'll start out with the vehicles. So this graph right here shows in the last 8 years the growth of the different sectors in the taxi market. You'll see yellow being for yellow cabs, greens for the lime green cabs. And then the gray-black is the non-app FHV. So that is any for-hire vehicle that is not an Uber, it's not a Lyft. But I think that the most important part of this graph is really that blue triangle, because you can see that incredible growth by app FHV vehicles. So you can imagine there's so many more vehicles now on the road, and that large contribution is in part due to the app companies. Now, with that many vehicles on the street, there's got to be a lot more trips, right? And certainly that is the case. When we look at data for the last few years, and I want you to concentrate on the blue and the yellow lines here, we are looking here at trips per month. You're not reading this wrong. The blue designating app companies are doing roughly 18 million trips a month. So imagine that's the data set that we're crunching each month. And you'll see that just incredible expansion over time. And that crisscross where the medallion trips, that is the yellow cab trips, have just been continuing to decline, right? So we're seeing that expansion in the app market and that sort of contraction, right, in the medallion market. Now, our driver pool is no exception to this expansion. We just have so many more drivers as we have vehicles and as we have trips. So you'll see here roughly a 70% increase in the last 8 years, and it just continues to grow. So you can imagine that as we're collecting more data, as we have more vehicles, as we have more trips, and we have more drivers, there's so much more responsibility that we have. And it's certainly been an operational challenge for people in our licensing division who have to process all these driver applications. But you're seeing a general trend that the apps are sort of growing, right? Now, we think about the app category as a whole. It doesn't tell us too much about sort of the different companies, right? We want to find out, I'm sure a lot of people are thinking, well, how many trips is Uber doing? How many trips is Lyft doing? Who's winning? You know, who's losing? Well, here we looked at the average trips per day by app. Here we have 5 apps. Uber and Lyft, I know you guys have in Austin. My understanding is you don't have Via, and you don't have Get or Juno, probably yet, maybe they will come here. But those are other apps in New York City that they operate. And you'll see here that overall, Uber, which is the gray in the center, is really controlling the market, right? It has the lion's share of trips. And you'll see pink for Lyft and blue for Via sort of inching away at that. But generally, Uber holds that lion's share, right? And so it's really interesting to see just how dominating Uber really is. When we think about these apps also, we have to think about the way people work, because all of us, for the most part, I would say probably I have one job. Most of us here are working for one job, right? But if you are a driver, you may be working for 2 companies. You may be working for 3, 4, 8, maybe even 5. So there's definitely a point at which some people are doing trips for Uber, but they're also doing trips for Lyft. And that's really important to understand, because there are implications to that kind of work behavior, right? So here, we looked at multi-platformers. We took data, we looked at it over time, and we counted the number of platforms people were working for, specifically the for-hire vehicle drivers. And so the most important thing here to really know is keep your eyes on the 2 lines that are the highest, 1 and 2. You'll see that the percent of drivers that were driving for one platform has slowly decreased over time. And the percent of drivers driving for 2 platforms is increasing, as is the percent driving for 3. And this has really important implications, because when you think about a dominating company like Uber, let's say, that provides trips to drivers when they go and take a trip, that company should be able to provide a lot of the trips, right? But in essence, what it looks like is that it's not doing that. It looks as though drivers are trying to supplement trips, perhaps, with other companies, right? And this is a strategy in optimizing financial gain, right, or optimizing the workflow. Something definitely to keep in mind, especially when we look at this map here because I wanted to see how dominant Uber really was in terms of the whole New York region. Well, when we look here, this is New York City, and we have our taxi zones. They're taxi zones for the purpose of this presentation, pretty much neighborhoods. And so you'll see that Uber really has control of almost all of the map, except for Manhattan, and for those familiar with the airport, JFK, which is all the way on the right, it's the bottom. So Uber's really been expanding a lot, very strongly. So it really does beg the question, what's going on with this multi-platforming? Why is Uber just so dominant, maybe not being able to provide those trips, right? So I'm going to take you through some new interesting takes. I know you guys have already probably learned a lot from this. Oh, wait, hang on a second. There. Is it okay?
We can fix it. Don't worry.
Yeah, it's fine. But anyway, so I'm sure you guys are learning a lot. But I'll preface this section by just saying that as of June 2017, we have started collecting from the for-hire vehicle industry. Got it. Drop-off data and shared ride data.
I have a question, lately.
Sure.
How do you get the data from Uber and private companies?
Legally, or you mean operational?
Is there a mandate for them to work in your area that you're required to give data?
Yeah. So we'll basically issue a directive saying that we require this data to operate as a way for them showing transparency, right? So to that point too, what I'll say is we actually, as of June 2017, we started collecting drop-off data from the app companies like Lyft and Uber, and from generally the for-hire vehicle industry. Before that, we only collected pickup location and pickup stamp, timestamp. So we're sort of expanding the data we're collecting. Since we got that drop-off data, we went ahead and just mapped it out side by side with the pickups. So we took all the trips, and then we put them on the pickup map, and we took all the drop-offs, and we put them on the drop-offs map. And I think looking at this, the first thing to really take away from it is they're not really that different. Like there's a few gradient differences, some gradients are more intense, you'll see some regions light up a little bit, but activity is generally very similar, right? It's sort of happening in the same place. And this really speaks to sort of the FHEV market's turf, if you will, right? And so this gave us an idea. We wanted to see if their drop-offs would be different, but they were pretty similar. Now, I'll skip over these because I want to get to this other one here. So once we had looked at drop-offs, we had looked at the pickups again, we were thinking about the shared rides because we'd also started collecting shared ride data. So now we can tell if any trip was shared or not. And so here we took all the shared trips and look at what the percentage of shared rides look like over time. And you'll see that at the end, towards February, we have about 12% shared rides out of all FHV trips. Now keep in mind that this percentage is it's including all the for-hire vehicle industry. So we're including your mom and pop operations, we're including Uber, we're including Lyft. If we were to look at only the app companies, this would probably be a lot higher because app companies really are the only ones that do the sharing. But overall, shared rides are continuing to grow. And if this pace keeps up, I think they should be pretty high, a lot higher soon. Now, we thought about what that would look like on a map, and I think this was really a lot of fun. I had one of my geospatial analysts make this. And here we put all the shared rides on the map by zone again, so think of it as by neighborhood, and we looked at it for each month. So here we have the percent of all shared rides of all the rides that happen in that zone, what percent are shared, right? So you'll see the darker spots toward the south parts of Brooklyn. Watch over time as they get darker and darker, and you see that expansion, right? Until we move to December, and it's really spread out. So what's really interesting, I think the biggest takeaway from here, not just the expansion of shared rides, really is where those shared rides are occurring. Because if you look very carefully, they're occurring, I wish I had a laser pointer, but they're occurring at the bottom in Brooklyn, in like East New York, and then also up by the Bronx. So those are areas that traditionally didn't have access to that great of transportation necessarily, and perhaps are low-income neighborhoods. So they actually benefit in a way from shared rides, right? From having that transportation alternative. So it's really good to have that. Okay. And I think the last thing I wanted to cover was just sort of transparency in the public. We are at a Socrata conference, and we do use Socrata in a TLC. We use it in the way we use open data. Our open data platform is built by them, and so all our trip record data is there and it's public. It's not just accessible through our website, so people can work with that data on open data. In addition to that, we also have our active drivers lists. These are lists that tell a company if a driver is suspended or not, if they're allowed to drive. And so this is really important because this sort of speaks to that consumer protection issue, right? Where we're trying to make sure that companies know which drivers can drive and which can't. In addition, we're working on rolling out some data blogs and working on getting a GitHub page rolling, so that'll be fun. Be on the lookout for that. I will say the last but not least, this is really important, it would be FOIL. For those unfamiliar with FOIL, that's like FOIA, the Freedom of Information Act, but for us it's FOIL with an O. And basically it allows the public or any entity to request any data that we have, so long as it's not proprietary or it's not going to impede on anyone's privacy, we're able to release that data. So we actually tackle a lot of FOIL requests because everybody just loves our data. So I get it too though, because I love data, so it's all good. But yeah, and that's a wrap. Thank you.
So here's a question, which would be really interesting, right? So with all advanced mobility and departments of transportation, would be a pretty cool mashup, would be taking all the MTA turnstile data and looking at it from subway station to subway station and overlaying the pickup and drop-off, origin and destination data, just to see and compare, is MTA increasing in capacity, decreasing in capacity, and does that have any correlation to the penetration of the destinations like you were showing?
Yeah, no, that would be really fascinating. There was a NYU's Rudin Center, I believe, they did a study of the 2nd Avenue subway station where they took taxi trip data and they placed it, they did a before and after picture after the 2nd Avenue subway was constructed to see like what were the sort of implications of that, right? So certainly the turnstile data would be invaluable in that.
Yeah, I mean, it has so many potential dependencies, and in terms of just planning out for the future, do we need more
I think the beauty of that, the beauty of what you're saying is that cities have to start changing the way they think, and I think this is happening. We have to start thinking of ourselves more as one functioning organism, like the entire city is working as a whole together, instead of each agency working on their own, right? And when you do that, you have to get past the bureaucracy and past sort of the structure, but if you can do that, then you can create a really powerful engine for change and innovation, so certainly.
I really like that you're tracking the hours that the drivers of the yellow, or Borough?
I'm sorry?
Borough drivers are, you're tracking the hours that the drivers drive for the yellow taxis and the Borough taxis. And are you doing the same thing when the for-hire drivers work, for instance, for Uber and Lyft, all in the same day, and then putting in a 14-hour day? Are you able to track that and regulate that?
Yeah. So we have multiple ways of tracking that. We have our IT team, our backend. They actually run the algorithm that does the fatigue policy tracking. For our team, just for research purposes, we track that a little different. What we do is we sandwich all the data together. So for a driver, let's say you drove for 4 companies and you drove all those trips, we aggregate all that time and then we assume that any time you took a certain type of break, that is the beginnings of a new shift. So in this case, let's say you took a 3-hour break, that's your shift break. And so now we're aggregating different types of shifts and that's how we track time. Now that's for research purposes. On the fatigue policy end, that's handled by our IT team because they run the algorithm in the back.
Thank you. How frequently are the Uber, or how frequently are Uber and Lyft sending the data to you? Is it a daily?
The data?
Yeah, the data.
Oh, I wish. No, it's roughly all the data comes in about, I'd say it's like 2 months behind usually.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I wish it was more real time, but it takes time for them.
Gotcha.
Hi, I'm curious what digging you've done to help explain the overall increase in volume for all the hired rides and how that tracks to population growth for New York City.
Can you repeat the first part?
Yeah, so just the overall huge increase in volume for all the different types of hired rides.
Mhm.
How does that track to population growth, and what other digging have you done to better explain why there's so many more rides now than before?
That's such a good question. I actually haven't, but you just gave me a new project to get to some analysts. So, yeah. Thank you.
What made you comfortable with releasing the pickup and drop-off location of every trip, and how that relates to personal information? I mean, it
What
may
made
not
us-
be personal
Oh, you
information.
mean in our open
in
data?
open data, yeah.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, to be fair, to be honest, like that was before I was around, so I don't know what their thinking was necessarily. I would say that at this point, though, we actually have changed the way we release that data. Before, we used to release it with latitude and longitude. There were concerns about tracking and privacy. So now that data is actually pegged to the zone, aka the little regions on the map that we were showing you, right? So now it's very difficult to really do much more than tell complete volume out of that, you know? It's like a catch-22, right? You want to release all that data so people can work with it. There's some amazing, just people interested in working with data out there, and it's great to have them working on that data, but then you do have to respect people's privacy. It's important that we as a government don't forget that, right?
Well, this is on, okay. Just want to say, Fausto, thank you so much. That was really enlightening and really entertaining, too. Give him a round of applause. Thank you, Fausto.